reveal your secrets.
Like many children's books, Harry Potter is filled with little, easy-to-decode life lessons, mostly in the form of fables and metaphors that are meant to be guides through some of life's challenges. Some of these fables deal with stuff that is pretty grown up, and maybe the most grown-up thing they tackle is depression. But I think its depiction, and it is depicted in these stories, has been misunderstood. The subject of loss and mourning is pretty well established throughout the books. One of the most prominent fables in the very first book is the Mirror of Erised, which allows Harry to see what he desires most, a reflection of himself in the company of his deceased parents, which causes him to fixate on the loss and stagnate in those emotions. The central lesson being that a bit of mourning is natural, even good, but to fixate on your grief can be crippling.
It does not do to dwell on dreams, Harry, and forget to live.
Though Harry never returns to the mirror, he does spend a good chunk of his teenage years staring at old photos of his parents, and he even sees their ghosts. Mourning is not the same as depression, but it can be complicated by depression or trigger a depressive episode. The first blatant attempt to deal with depression specifically is in the third book, when Harry encounters the Dementors. The Dementors are dark creatures that feed on happy thoughts and drain them from people. Their presence is accompanied by a sense of coldness and hopelessness. Given enough time, they'll drain everything from you, leaving you soulless and empty. You won't die, but you'll be changed. Sounds a lot like depression, doesn't it? I'm not the first person to make this comparison. There are quite a few articles praising Rowling's depiction of depression, and the idea seems to be pretty well circulated amongst her fans. If that isn't clear enough, Rowling herself claimed in this interview that the intention was for these creatures to symbolize aspects of depression.
Because I know you went through a period of depression, and I had read that the Dementors came from that depression.
Completely, yeah. Depression is clinical depression is a terrible place to be. But it's that cold absence of feeling, that really hollowed out feeling. That's what the Dementors are.
But does this idea really hold up? How well does this idea actually map onto real-life depression? To figure that out, we first have to clarify what we mean by depression, which isn't as easy as it seems. In explaining depression, it always has to be separated from the way that it's casually used. Most people use this word to describe a dark and unhappy feeling that goes away after a while.
Oh, God! Now I'm depressed.
But the author seems to want to deal with clinical depression. And what's really the difference? Clinical depression, or major depression, is biological as much as it is psychological. It looks like a slow and sluggish state, but a few things are exactly the opposite, overactive. The body expends a lot of energy on this intense hormonal stress response, and everything else is slowed. It's partly genetic, partly influenced by things that happen in early childhood, and it usually goes on for quite a long time. Robert Sapolsky explains the simplest definition he can come up with.
It's a biochemical disorder with a genetic component, and early experience influences where somebody can't appreciate sunsets. And that's what this disease is about.
To be diagnosed with major depression, you'd probably be showing most of these symptoms for at least 2 weeks. And most importantly, you'd have this one.
Anhedonia. Hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, and hedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, that is what a depression is about.
And this, right here, is what we're going to latch onto for the rest of the essay. This is that inability to appreciate sunsets. Back to the Dementors. At first glance, it seems that the Dementors do accurately describe the experience of depression. Ron describes an encounter with them like this.
I felt weird though. Like I'd never be cheerful again.
And Harry thinks he sees his father during another encounter, which indicates a level of grief that could be delusional.
I saw my dad.
What?
The experience also affects everyone differently based on, as the movie explains it, early experience influences.
The Dementors affect you most of all because there are true horrors in your past, horrors your classmates can scarcely imagine.
As kind of an interesting detour, after Harry passes out the first time, Professor Lupin gives him chocolate, which makes him feel better. Chocolate does have some mood-enhancing qualities, but according to this experiment, chocolate could increase your risk of depression in the long term, but it's very clearly displayed here as a short-term solution. I think only one majorly important thing prevents this from being a really good metaphor for depression. The way to overcome the Dementors is by casting a Patronus, which is a magical spell wherein a deeply happy memory takes the form of an animal made of silvery light that drives away the Dementors. While this is an enchanting part of the world, as a metaphor, it doesn't quite fit with the defining characteristic of depression. A major depressive wouldn't be able to fight off their depression with positive thinking. You can't fight an inability to appreciate sunsets by appreciating sunsets. In addition to this, Harry's godfather, Sirius Black, claims to have escaped the Dementors by being filled with determination, which is another thing that wouldn't really work for a major depressive. So I guess it doesn't really work as a metaphor for major depression. But is it really a failure on the writer's part? Isn't it more of a failure of interpretation to project this idea onto the story? Setting depression aside, it does seem to describe something that most of us are familiar with. The Dementors seem to describe really deep and maybe really profound feelings of sadness. These feelings can appear unexpectedly, and for those who feel the effect of them a lot more deeply than others, it's harder, though not impossible, to find it in yourself to appreciate sunsets in their presence. But being surrounded by them for too long without any tools to deal with them could lead to something a lot more serious. In this context, the Patronus could represent a good way to deal with this in real life. It's not just as simple as thinking happy thoughts, but Harry has to practice this technique to become good at it.
You know, this is very advanced magic, well beyond the ordinary wizarding level.
The idea of practicing happy thoughts like this actually maps pretty well onto some real-life practices shown to improve well-being, like keeping a gratitude journal. And even, at a real stretch, CBT, which can help to prevent those at risk of depression from falling into thought patterns that can push them over the edge. A lot of stuff still muddies the metaphorical waters. The Dementors awaken a repressed memory in Harry, and the way time travel gets involved suggests that the overall theme is actually believing in your potential as an overpowering positive emotion that can drive away the Dementors.
I saw myself conjuring the Patronus before. I knew I could do it this time because, well, I'd already done it.
That makes it seem like a metaphor for something else entirely, like overcoming obstacles or achieving greatness. You could argue that none of this was intended to be read this way. It's possible this is just a personal interpretation of the author's own experiences, not intended to be instructive. In that case, I couldn't fault it. But here's the point. Calling this depression is a disservice to the story. It's a hindrance to interpretation, and more importantly, if the goal is to destigmatize a mental health issue, this idea would do the opposite. Anyone who believes that this is depression will undoubtedly have a terrible misunderstanding of depressed people and what they're dealing with. Depression, true clinical depression, is not that.
There's always this little voice between the lines there of, come on, pull yourself together. We all deal with this sort of thing. We all get depressed, and then we get better. We cope, we heal, we deal with things in life. What's the deal with you that you can't do that? Depression is as real of a biological disorder as is juvenile diabetes. And you don't sit down a diabetic and say, oh, come on, what's with this insulin stuff? Stop bathing with yourself and pull it together. This is just as much of a biological disorder.
So the Dementors don't fit the bill for depression. But there is something else in the series that does. Pretty effectively. In the Deathly Hallows, Harry, Ron, and Hermione are in hiding, out in the countryside looking for horcruxes. At this point, Harry has just about mastered the Patronus spell, and he can overcome a lot of Dementors at once. But all of that changes once he gets hold of the first horcrux, the locket. The locket is a very dark object, and after wearing it for a while, Harry starts to feel some changes. He's insecure. He's soaked in a dark mood that he doesn't understand. He feels guilty for bringing his friends into hiding with him, and imagines them having private conversations about him. The crucial scene is short, and it doesn't even make it into the movie. Harry, Ron, and Hermione have set up camp in the countryside. They're starving. So Harry goes out to find food, but he crosses paths with a horde of Dementors. The solution is simple. Evoke a happy memory and cast a Patronus. Harry has the skill to do this. He's perfectly capable. Yet, he fails to even try. He returns to the camp empty-handed, feeling ashamed. He might appear sluggish or lazy, but he has a raging mixture of things going on internally. They quickly figure out that the locket is the cause of this mood, but it can't be destroyed by any known spell. They just have to live with the locket and all of its side effects until they can find a unique, mysterious object capable of destroying it. The Sword of Gryffindor. This is far from a comprehensive picture of depression, and a far cry from the worst of it, but it's a much better metaphor. In this short segment, Harry indicates nearly all of these symptoms, and the Dementors actually become an important part of getting at the defining characteristic of depression. Casting a Patronus relies on one's ability to appreciate sunsets, and with the locket on, Harry can't do it. The flaw in the previous metaphor is literally the strength of this one. Luckily, with this kind of depression, you can just turn it off by removing the locket.
Better?
Right.
But this actually counts in the metaphor's favor. As the characters take turns wearing it, it lets you see how they function differently in this dark situation with and without depression. Finally, it's not something they can easily overcome. There's no spell they know that can destroy it. They can't even find the Sword of Gryffindor on their own. They need to be led to it with outside help. This is so much closer to an accurate depiction of the disorder, and it actually goes a good way to depicting some of the disabling qualities that the disorder can have. The fact that so many people, myself included, believed that the Dementors were a good metaphor for depression, when a better metaphor was so close to it, is not something I want to blame on ignorance.
It's a significant poverty of the language that we use the same word to describe how a child feels when it rains on the day of his baseball game and how someone feels who decides to commit suicide.
Ideas travel further in small packages, and the fact that a lot of this writing didn't make it into the movies probably has a lot to do with why this idea so far hasn't been replaced with this one. But it seems to me that it's a simple fix for something that's worth trying to understand. The entire series is a journey of overcoming your inner struggles, and I think depression and the risk of falling prey to it plays a major role in the larger themes of this book. And so for the fans, I think it's a much better way to appreciate the books.